12 seconds. That's all the video was. 12 seconds of my 75-year-old mother hitting the linoleum floor of the diner she'd run for 40 years, her glasses skittering under a booth, while a grown man stood over her laughing. 12 seconds. And I knew before the video even finished playing that nothing in my life was ever going to be the same again. I want to tell you something about silence. Real silence. The kind that has weight to it. The kind that presses down on your chest like a hand. I've heard it in combat zones, in the gap between an incoming round and the explosion that follows. I've heard it in hospital corridors at 3 in the morning. But I had never heard it the way I heard it that Tuesday afternoon, standing in a briefing room at Fort Bragg with a laser pointer still in my hand, when my phone buzzed against the table and I saw my neighbor Carol's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer it. We were in the middle of a logistics review, and the colonel was mid-sentence about supply chain redundancies. But something in me, call it instinct, call it 20 years of learning to trust the small alarm bells your body rings before your mind catches up, made me pick it up. Nicole. Carol's voice was shaking so hard I almost didn't recognize it. Nicole, you need to see this right now. Your mom. That was as far as she got before the video came through. I stepped into the hallway. My hands were steady. They're always steady. It's the one thing the army beat into me so deep it doesn't even feel like discipline anymore. It feels like bone. But something underneath my ribs was not steady at all. I pressed play. The diner. My mother's diner. The one with the cracked red vinyl booths and the bell over the door that's been ringing since before I was born. Evelyn Turner, standing behind the counter in her apron, the one with the coffee stain shaped like Ohio that she refuses to throw away. And a man, young, maybe early 30s, built like he spent a lot of time in a gym and not enough time anywhere else, leaning across that counter with his finger in her face. I couldn't hear what he was saying at first. The phone that captured it was too far away, held low, half hidden, someone scared to even be filming. But I could see my mother shaking her head. I could see her small hands, the hands that used to braid my hair before school, coming up in a gesture I know better than my own name. The gesture that means I won't. I won't sign. I won't sell. And then he hit her. Not a shove. Not an accident. An open-palmed slap that snapped her head sideways and put her on the floor before she even understood it was happening. The sound of it came through tiny and flat on my phone speaker, but I swear to God, I felt it in my own jaw. The diner was full. I could see them in the background. Regulars. People I've known since I was 6 years old. People who used to slip me extra pancakes when my mother wasn't looking. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. They just watched a 75-year-old widow get knocked to the ground in the restaurant she built with her own hands, and not one of them stood up. The man straightened his jacket. He looked almost bored, the way you look bored after finishing a chore you've done 100 times before. And then he said the words I would hear on a loop for the rest of that day, the rest of that flight home, the rest of my life, probably. Around here, I do whatever I want. I stood in that hallway with the phone still in my hand, and something in me went very quiet and very cold. Not the panic kind of cold. The other kind. The kind I'd felt exactly twice before in my life. Once in a convoy outside Kandahar, when I realized we'd driven into something we shouldn't have. And once at my father's funeral, watching them fold the flag into a triangle and hand it to my mother's shaking hands. I requested emergency leave standing right there in that hallway. I didn't sit back down at the table. I didn't finish the briefing. My commanding officer found me 20 minutes later throwing files into my bag, and he just nodded, the way people nod when they can see in your face that there's no version of this conversation that ends with you staying. The drive to the airfield took 11 minutes. I don't remember most of it. What I remember is my father's voice, the one memory that kept surfacing no matter how hard I tried to push it back down. He'd said it to me the week before he died, sitting on the porch with a glass of iced tea sweating a ring onto the wood, watching the sun go down over land that had been in our family for 3 generations. "Nicole," he'd said, in that low, even voice he used when he wanted you to actually listen instead of just hear. "Whatever happens to this family, and something's coming, I can feel it. You don't use that uniform to get even with anybody. You hear me? The uniform is not a weapon for revenge. It's a promise you made to something bigger than yourself." I hadn't understood it then. I was 38, freshly promoted, more interested in readiness reports than my father's cryptic warnings about a something he wouldn't name. Now, watching my mother's body hit that floor over and over on a 12-second loop, I understood exactly what he meant. And I made myself a promise of my own, right there in the front seat of my car, with the engine running and my hands finally starting to shake. This time, I will not use force. I will use the law. And I will not stop until every single person who let this happen understands exactly what they've done. The flight home felt endless and instant at the same time, the way grief does. I stared out the window at the clouds thinning into dusk, and somewhere over the state line I stopped being Lieutenant Colonel Turner, battalion commander, decorated officer. I became something older than my rank, something that had nothing to do with the eagle on my collar. I became somebody's daughter coming home. The wheels touched down just after 10 that night. I walked off that plane in the dark, my duffel bag over one shoulder, and whatever was in my eyes when I stepped onto that tarmac, my driver told me later it scared him a little. I don't doubt it for a second. Because for the first time in my career, I wasn't thinking about mission objectives or rules of engagement. I was thinking about a bell over a diner door and a woman who deserved so much better than what this town had just shown her. The hospitals smelled like every hospital smells, that mix of antiseptic and fear that never quite washes out of your memory once you've spent enough time in one. I found her room on the 3rd floor, and I stood outside the door for exactly 4 seconds before I could make myself walk in, because I needed those 4 seconds to arrange my face into something that wouldn't scare her. She was smaller than I remembered. That's the thing nobody tells you about seeing your parents after something like this. They shrink. Not literally, but somehow the bed swallows them, and the blue paper gown makes them look like a stranger wearing your mother's face. Her left arm was in a sling, her shoulder fractured, and there was a bruise blooming purple and yellow along her cheekbone that made my stomach turn over. She saw me and her whole face changed. Not relief exactly. Something closer to dread. "Nicole." Her voice was thin but sharp, the same voice that used to catch me sneaking out my bedroom window at 16. "You didn't need to fly all the way home for this." I sat down in the plastic chair beside her bed and took her good hand in both of mine. "Mom, somebody hit you. Somebody put you on the floor of your own restaurant." "I'm fine." She squeezed my fingers, and even now, even broken, there was steel in that grip. 40 years of turning over hash browns and standing 12-hour shifts will do that to a woman. "It looks worse than it is." "It looks like assault," I said. "Because it is assault." Her eyes went somewhere else, past me, toward the window and the parking lot lights beyond it. "Please, honey, don't make this bigger than it needs to be. Please. Don't gather storm. Don't gather storm." That was an old phrase of hers, something her own mother used to say, meaning, don't go looking for trouble that isn't yours to find. But this trouble had walked right into her diner and put its hand on her face, and I would not, let that phrase talk me out of what I already knew I had to do. "I'm not gathering anything, Mom. I'm just going to find out what happened." She didn't answer. She just closed her eyes, and I sat there another 20 minutes, listening to the soft, mechanical beep of the monitor, memorizing the rise and fall of her chest, before I finally kissed her forehead and told her I'd be back in the morning. The diner, when I got there, looked like a crime scene that everyone had agreed to pretend wasn't one. The booths were empty except for 2 old-timers nursing coffee in the corner, the overhead lights buzzing too bright for how quiet the room had gone. I asked the waitress on shift, a young woman named Kayla who used to babysit for a family down the road, what she'd seen. "I didn't see nothing," she said, not meeting my eyes, wiping down a counter that was already clean. I asked the cook. Same answer, different words. I asked the two old men in the corner booth, men who had been coming to this diner every single morning of my childhood, men my mother had fed on credit more times than either of us could count when times were hard. "Didn't see a thing, Nicole," one of them said, and I watched his hand tremble slightly around his coffee cup as he said it. I want you to understand what that felt like. Not anger, not yet. Something colder and stranger. The specific, dislocating feeling of standing in a place that has known you your whole life and realizing it has decided, collectively, silently, to look the other way. I asked to see the security camera footage. The owner of the building, not my mother, she only leases the space, told me the system had glitched that afternoon. No footage. Convenient. Tidy. And about as believable as a $3 bill. I went to the sheriff's office next, still in my travel clothes, my army ID tucked in my back pocket, because I wasn't ready yet to pull that particular card. Sheriff Don Harper had the kind of face that had learned over decades exactly how to look sympathetic while telling you nothing at all. "Miss Turner," he said. Not Colonel. Which told me he already knew exactly who I was and had decided not to acknowledge it. "I understand you're upset, but from what my deputy gathered, this looks like your mother had some kind of fall." "A fall," I said. I let the two words sit there between us like something rotten. Elderly folks, sometimes they lose their balance. "It's sad, but it happens." He shrugged, a small, practiced gesture. Without clear video evidence, without a single witness willing to go on record, there's not much of a case to build, Miss Turner. I looked at that man for a long moment. Long enough that his eyes flicked away from mine first. 20 years in the military teaches you to read a room, to read a man's posture, the way his hands move when he's lying versus when he's telling the truth. Sheriff Harper's hands were folded very still on his desk, and his eyes would not hold mine, and every instinct I had sharpened on years of interrogations and battlefield judgment calls told me this was not incompetence. This was a decision. Somebody had made a decision, and Sheriff Harper was simply following it. I walked out of that office into the parking lot and stood there a moment under a sky gone the color of a fresh bruise, and I let myself feel, just for 30 seconds, the full weight of what I was up against. Not one angry man. A whole town that had learned, over years I didn't yet understand, to keep its head down and its mouth shut. That night, back at my mother's empty house, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of me, there was a knock at the door. Soft. Hesitant. The kind of knock that belongs to someone checking over their shoulder before they make it. It was Kayla, the young waitress from the diner. She was out of her uniform now, wearing a hoodie with the hood half up, like she was trying to disappear inside it. She didn't say much. She just handed me her phone, already opened to a video file, and said, "I filmed more than what got sent around." I was scared to show anyone. "But your mom's always been good to me." I watched it standing right there in the doorway, the porch light throwing long shadows across the yard. And there, in the background of the footage, half hidden behind a rack of pie tins, stood a tall man in an expensive gray suit, watching the entire thing unfold with his arms crossed and no expression on his face at all. Not shock. Not concern. Just the flat, patient look of a man observing something proceeding exactly according to plan. I didn't know his name yet, but I would. Kayla told me before she left that night, standing on the porch with her arms wrapped around herself against the evening chill. Wade Kane, the man who owned half the commercial property in this county, and most of the men who worked in it, including apparently the sheriff's department. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my mother's kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of coffee that went cold twice, and I did what 20 years in the Army had trained me to do better than almost anything else. I started building a picture, one piece of intelligence at a time. The next morning, I drove out to the county records office. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending 6 hours combing through property deeds and permit filings under fluorescent lights, while a clerk kept glancing at me like she wasn't sure if she should be helping me or warning someone that I was there. But by the end of that day, I had something. A pattern. And once you see a pattern like this, you cannot unsee it. Over 30 households, going back nearly 6 years, had sold land to Kane Realty Group under circumstances that all shared the same strange shape. A family would refuse an initial offer. Weeks later, something would happen. A barn fire here, a car accident there, a sudden and mysterious lien on a property that had been paid off for a decade. And within months, that family's name would appear on a new deed, land transferred to Kane Realty at a fraction of its worth. Every single case had been handled by the sheriff's department, closed out fast, no follow-up, no loose threads. Every permit, every zoning variance Wade Kane had ever needed had been signed without delay by the mayor. I sat in my rental car outside that records office as the sun went down, my hands cold around the steering wheel, and I felt something shift inside my chest that I hadn't expected. Not just anger at what had happened to my mother. Something bigger and colder. The recognition that this town I grew up in, the one with the diner and the bell over the door and the 4th of July parade down Main Street, had a rot running through its foundation that went back years. And my mother's slapped face was just the newest bruise on an old wound. And then I found my father's name. 6 years ago, buried in a filing about a parcel adjoining our property, a strip of land my father had owned outright since before I was born. Land Wade Kane had wanted badly enough to send 3 separate offers in the span of 4 months. My father had refused every single one. There was a note in the file, handwritten from an assessor's visit. Owner uncooperative, recommends escalation. And beside it, in different ink, a date. 3 weeks after that date, my father died in a car accident, on a stretch of road he had driven 10,000 times in his life, on a clear night, with no other vehicle involved. I remember exactly where I was sitting when I made that connection, because the coffee cup slipped out of my hand and shattered on the kitchen floor, and I didn't even flinch. I just sat there staring at that word, uncooperative, feeling the entire architecture of my understanding of my father's death crack down the middle. I had believed for 6 years that I'd lost my father to bad luck. A patch of black ice, maybe, or a deer in the road, or simply the terrible randomness that takes good men before their time. That's the story my mother told me. That's the story I told myself every year at his grave. Now I sat in that kitchen and let myself consider, for the first time, that my father hadn't died of bad luck at all. 2 days later, a man showed up at my mother's door I didn't recognize. He was in his 70s, wearing a cardigan despite the heat, carrying a leather satchel that looked older than I was. He introduced himself as Harold Weiss, a retired attorney who had practiced in this county for 40 years, before Wade Kane, in his words, made it impossible to practice honestly here anymore. He sat at that same kitchen table, the one with the coffee stain I still hadn't wiped up, and he opened that satchel like a man unburdening something he'd carried far too long. "Your father came to me," he said, "about 6 weeks before he died. He'd figured out what Kane was doing. Not just the land grabs. The whole machine behind it. The falsified appraisals, the kickbacks to the sheriff's office, the permits the mayor was signing in exchange for a piece of every deal." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were photocopied land records side by side with contracts that didn't match, signatures that had clearly been altered, dates that didn't line up with the paper trail. And beneath all of it, a small black recorder, the kind you'd buy at a drugstore electronics counter, its casing scratched and worn. "Your father recorded a meeting," Weiss said quietly. "The last one he ever attended before he died. I've had this in a safe deposit box for 6 years, waiting for someone in your family brave enough or angry enough to come looking." I didn't know if that would ever happen. But then I saw the video from the diner circulating online, and I saw your name attached to it, Lieutenant Colonel, and I thought, maybe now. I sat there holding that recorder in both hands, feeling its weight, feeling 6 years of silence pressing out of it like something finally exhaling. He knew, I said. Not really a question. He knew everything, Weiss said. And I believe, though I can never prove it in a way that would satisfy a jury on its own, that it's exactly why he's not here anymore. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it would be easy to tell you it was rage, pure and simple, the kind of thing that makes for a satisfying story. But it wasn't only rage. It was grief, fresh and sharp as the day we buried him, mixed with something that felt almost like relief. The relief of finally understanding a shape I'd been staring at for 6 years without seeing clearly. My father hadn't died by accident. My father had died protecting something, and he had left behind, without ever telling a soul, the exact evidence I would need to finish what he started. I looked at that old recorder sitting on the table between us, and I made a decision that would change everything that came after. It was time to stop investigating quietly. I decided, for the time being, to keep my rank quiet. It wasn't strategy exactly, not at first. It was more that I wanted to see this town the way my mother saw it every single day, without the shield of a uniform standing between me and the truth of how people actually behaved when they thought no one important was watching. So the next morning I walked into the diner in jeans and an old university sweatshirt, my hair pulled back, nothing on me that said Lieutenant Colonel. I sat in the corner booth, the one closest to the register, and I watched. My mother was back at work already, against every piece of advice her doctor had given her, her arm still in its sling, moving behind that counter with a stubbornness I recognized because I inherited every bit of it. She was pouring coffee for a trucker when the bell over the door rang, and Travis Kane walked in like he owned the place, which I was beginning to understand in every way that mattered in this town. He believed he did. He was younger than I expected up close. Early 30s. Built like a man who spent a lot of money on a gym membership and not nearly enough time reading a book. He grinned when he saw my mother, an easy, casual grin that made my skin crawl precisely because of how comfortable it was. "Well, look who's back at it," he said, sliding onto a stool at the counter like this was any other Tuesday. "Your daughter come home, Evelyn? I heard she flew all the way in from wherever it is she plays soldier." My mother's hand went very still around the coffee pot. "Travis, please. Just order something and go." "I heard she's been asking around," he said, not moving, watching her face carefully now. "Talking to folks at the records office. Digging around in things that aren't her business." I felt every muscle in my body go taut, but I didn't move from that booth. "Not yet. She's just worried about her mother," Evelyn said, quiet, careful, the voice of a woman who has spent years learning exactly how much pressure a situation can take before it breaks. Any daughter would be. Travis's eyes drifted around the diner, and I watched him clock every face in the room, cataloging who was watching, who was pretending not to. Then his eyes landed on me. Just another woman in a booth as far as he knew. Nobody worth a second look. I stood up anyway. I walked to the counter, close enough that he had to turn on his stool to face me. "You must be Travis," I said, my voice even, flat, the same tone I use when I'm briefing officers on something they don't want to hear. "I'm Nicole, Evelyn's daughter." Something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or the first faint prickle of caution. But it didn't last. He leaned back, propped an elbow on the counter, and let that easy grin spread wide again. "Oh, this is the one. The soldier girl." He said soldier girl like it was something you'd scrape off a boot. "Your mama's been telling me all about you." "I doubt that," I said. "Let me give you some advice, since you're new back in town." He leaned in slightly, dropping his voice like he was doing me a kindness. "Around here, I'm the law. You go around asking questions, digging through records that aren't yours to dig through, It doesn't end well for people. Ask your daddy. The room went very quiet. I felt something in my chest turn to iron. My father died 6 years ago, I said, keeping my voice level even as every word he'd said rearranged itself into a threat I understood with total clarity. In a car accident. That's right. Travis smiled wider, like we were sharing a joke. Car accidents happen. Especially to people who don't know when to leave things alone. I did not raise my voice. I did not clench my fist, though God knows every instinct in my body wanted me to. I simply looked at him the way I've looked at men who believed their power made them untouchable, and I said, very quietly, no. He blinked. No, what? No, it's not going to end well for you. I let that sit a moment. The law is coming. It's just a little late. He stood up off that stool fast, his chair scraping loud against the floor, and shoved my shoulder. Not hard enough to be arrestable. Calculated exactly to that line, the way a man who's done this before knows precisely how far he can go. Watch yourself, he said, all the humor gone from his voice now. That's when the door opened and Sheriff Harper walked in like he'd been called, like he'd been waiting somewhere close by for exactly this moment. He didn't even look at Travis. Miss Turner, he said to me. I think it would be best if you left the premises. Don't want any trouble. I stared at him. My own mother's diner, and the sheriff was telling the victim's daughter to leave, while the man who'd assaulted her stood 2 feet away with his chest puffed out. And that is the exact moment 2 black SUVs pulled up outside, engines idling, and every head in that diner turned toward the windows. A man in army dress uniform stepped out of the lead vehicle, and I recognized him instantly. Colonel James Whitfield, my direct superior, a man I had served under for 6 years, a man who did not make casual visits to small towns in the middle of nowhere. He walked in, removed his cap, and said, with perfect military formality, in a voice that filled that entire diner, "Good afternoon, Colonel Turner." I watched every single face in that room rearrange itself in real time. The waitress who'd said she saw nothing. The 2 old-timers in the corner booth. Sheriff Harper, whose mouth actually fell open. And Travis Kane, standing there in the middle of the diner floor, watching his easy grin die on his face for the very first time since I'd walked through that door. Because a soldier girl was one thing to dismiss. A lieutenant colonel in the United States Army was something else entirely. Colonel Whitfield didn't stay long. He'd come, he told me quietly outside the diner while the whole town watched through the windows, because word had reached the base that a family member of one of his officers was under threat, and because he'd known my father briefly decades ago. Back when he was a young captain stationed nearby. That detail landed on me like a physical weight. My father's shadow, it turned out, stretched further than I'd ever known. But I want to be very clear about something, because it matters to how this story unfolds. I did not ask Colonel Whitfield to bring soldiers into this fight. I did not want a military solution to a civilian problem. My father's words were still sitting in my chest like a stone. Don't use the uniform as a weapon for revenge. This wasn't going to be revenge. It was going to be justice built the right way, brick by brick, with paper and law and patience. So instead, I made calls. Not to anyone in uniform, but to people whose job it was to investigate exactly this kind of rot. I called an old friend from officer training who now worked with the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, not because this was a military matter, but because she knew people, and people who know people is how these things start moving. She connected me to a contact at the FBI's field office 2 counties over, a woman named Special Agent Renata Cole, who listened to me for 40 minutes without interrupting once, and then said 6 words I will remember for the rest of my life. Send me everything you have. I did. Harold Weiss's recorder, the land records, the photocopied contracts with signatures that didn't match, the pattern of 30-plus households across 6 years. Everything. Within a week, The Department of Justice had opened a preliminary inquiry into potential racketeering, and the Office of the Inspector General had flagged the Sheriff's Department for a pattern of conduct review going back a decade. I sat in my mother's kitchen reading emails from federal investigators I had never met, feeling something I hadn't felt in a very long time. The specific, quiet satisfaction of watching a machine larger than any one person's cruelty finally begin to turn. The investigation moved into the county's finances, tracing wire transfers between Kane Realty Group and accounts connected to Sheriff Harper and the mayor. What they found wasn't subtle, once someone with the right authority started looking. Money moving in patterns too regular to be coincidence, always timed within weeks of a new deed transfer, always structured just under the reporting thresholds that would have triggered automatic scrutiny. Except automatic scrutiny doesn't work when the person supposed to trigger it is on the payroll. Meanwhile, something else was happening that none of us had planned for. Kayla's video, the 12-second clip that started all of this, had made its way onto social media, shared first by someone in town, then by a local news station, then picked up by a national outlet looking for a story about small-town corruption. Within 4 days, it had been viewed nearly 9 million times. I did not orchestrate that. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy telling this story to make myself out as some kind of mastermind pulling every string. I wasn't. The video simply existed, and it was ugly, and America has always had an appetite for watching ugly things get exposed to sunlight. What the exposure did, though, was give other people courage. That's the part that still catches in my throat when I think about it. A woman whose family farm had been sold to Kane Realty 4 years earlier, under circumstances eerily similar to what I'd found in the records, came forward, gave an interview on camera. Said the words out loud she'd apparently been too afraid to say to anyone for years. They burned my barn to make me sign. Then came another man. Then an elderly couple whose kids I used to babysit for. Then 4 more families whose names I recognized from my long night at the county records office. One by one, they stepped into the light. I understood something about fear that I don't think I'd ever fully understood before, despite years of leading soldiers into genuinely dangerous places. Fear isolates people. It convinces each person that they're the only one who saw what they saw, the only one carrying what they're carrying. All it takes to break that isolation is one person going first. I like to think Kayla handing me her phone on that porch was the first domino. But really, if I'm being honest with myself, I think it was my mother refusing to sign, refusing to sell, even after everything. Some kinds of courage are allowed. Hers was quiet, and it had been holding this whole rotten structure at bay for years without any of us realizing it. Sheriff Harper predictably panicked. 2 weeks into the federal inquiry, one of his own deputies, working a night shift, noticed him hauling boxes of physical files out of the evidence room into the trunk of his personal vehicle at 11 at night. That deputy took photos on his own phone before he lost his nerve and sent them anonymously to Agent Cole's office the next morning. It didn't matter in the end. We'd already had copies of everything that mattered for weeks. Harold Weiss, it turned out, had made 3 separate sets of duplicates of every document in his satchel, stored in 3 different safe deposit boxes across 2 states. A habit he told me he'd developed 40 years ago after watching a different case get buried by a different set of powerful men. Paper only disappears, he told me, if you only keep 1 copy. The FBI obtained a search warrant for the sheriff's office on a Thursday morning. I stood across the street with my mother, her arm finally out of its sling, watching federal agents carry out boxes and computer equipment while Sheriff Don Harper stood in the parking lot in his uniform. Stripped of any authority to stop what was happening, his face the exact color of old ash. My mother reached over and took my hand, the way she used to when I was small and the world felt too big and too loud. "Your father would be proud of you," she said. I didn't trust myself to answer her. I just held her hand a little tighter and watched justice, slow and unglamorous and entirely without violence, finally begin to arrive. The arrests happened on a Monday. Federal agents took Travis Kane into custody first, at 7 in the morning, at the gym where he worked out every day like clockwork, a habit that made him easy to find and easier still to arrest without incident. I heard later that he didn't resist, that he simply stood there in his workout clothes while an agent read him his rights, his face blank in a way people who knew him said they'd never seen before. Wade Kane was harder to reach. He had lawyers on retainer who tried for 3 frantic hours to negotiate some kind of delay, some quiet surrender that would spare him the indignity of handcuffs in front of his office staff. The Department of Justice wasn't interested in sparing him anything. By 10 that morning, Wade Kane, the man who had built half this town and quietly broken the other half, was walked out of his own real estate office in restraints, past a small crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk. People who had watched him drive past in his black SUV for 20 years without ever once looking any of them in the eye. Sheriff Don Harper was arrested at his home. 2 county commissioners went down with him, men whose names I recognized from zoning approval documents stretching back years. Men who had signed off on every variance and permit Wade Kane ever needed in exchange for envelopes that showed up with grim regularity on the 15th of every month. Kane's longtime attorney, the same man who had drafted half the falsified contracts I'd found in Harold Weiss's satchel, was indicted the same week on charges of fraud and obstruction. The mayor didn't wait to be arrested. She resigned that same afternoon, standing in front of the county courthouse in a navy blue suit, reading a statement that used the word misunderstanding 4 times and the word accountability not once. 2 days later, federal agents charged her anyway. Resignation, it turns out, isn't a form of immunity. I want to tell you about the recording, because it mattered more than I expected it to. Harold Weiss's small black drugstore recorder, the one my father had used to capture the last meeting he ever attended, turned out to contain something none of us had anticipated. Not just my father's calm, measured voice asking pointed questions about falsified appraisals. It contained Wade Kane's own voice, unmistakable, agreeing to terms that amounted to an open confession of the entire scheme. Recorded 6 years earlier by a man who must have known on some level that he was documenting the exact evidence that might one day matter more than his own safety. Federal prosecutors called it the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case. I call it my father's last act of love for a family he wouldn't live to see protected. I sat in a small federal building 2 counties over the week the charges were formally filed, listening to an agent read through the counts against Wade Kane and Sheriff Harper. Racketeering, extortion, fraud, obstruction of justice. And in a paragraph that made my hands go cold as I read it, a reopened homicide investigation into the circumstances surrounding my father's death. Not yet a charge. An investigation. But after 6 years of believing I'd lost my father to bad luck, even the word investigation felt like something breaking open inside my chest. Travis Kane, out on a bond his father's lawyers had scrambled to arrange, found me one last time before the arraignment. It was in the parking lot outside the courthouse, gray sky overhead, news cameras setting up 30 yards away. He looked smaller than he had in the diner. Not physically, he was still built the same way, but something in him had deflated, the swagger gone out of it entirely. "This is all because of one slap," he said, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. "You did all this because I hit an old woman." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about my mother's hands shaking around a coffee pot. I thought about 30 families who'd lost their land to fear dressed up as bad luck. I thought about my father driving home on a clear night, on a road he knew better than his own hands, 3 weeks after an assessor's file noted him as uncooperative. "No," I said. "It's not because of one slap." He waited, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something like real fear cross his face. "It's because for decades," I said, "people like you and your father decided you were above the law. That the law was something other people had to follow." My mother refused to sell her diner, and instead of taking no for an answer like a decent human being, you decided the answer didn't matter. That's not one slap, Travis. That's a whole philosophy of cruelty. And it finally ran into someone who wasn't willing to look away. He didn't say anything else. He just turned and walked toward the courthouse doors, flanked by his lawyer, his shoulders no longer squared with the confidence I remembered from that first day at the diner counter. My mother called me that evening. She'd watched the arrests on the local news, sitting in her own living room, in the house my father built. And her voice, when I answered, had something in it I hadn't heard in years. Relief. Real, unguarded relief. "It's over," she said quietly. I didn't correct her, though I knew, in the way you know these things after 20 years of watching how justice actually moves through the world, that it wasn't quite over yet. There would be trials. There would be appeals. There would be a homicide investigation into my father's death that might take months or years to reach any kind of conclusion. But something essential had ended that Monday all the same. The silence had ended. The fear that had kept an entire town looking the other way for years had finally cracked open. And in its place, for the first time since I could remember, something like hope was beginning to take root. A year moves differently when you've spent it watching a broken thing slowly get rebuilt. I want to tell you about the last day of that year, because it's the day I think about most now, more than any of the arrests, more than the headlines, more than the long months of testimony that followed. The diner had been closed for renovations for 6 weeks that spring. Not because it needed to be, the old bones of the place were fine, but because the town had decided, almost without anyone officially deciding anything, that this building deserved to be more than it had been. Donations came in from 3 states. A contractor from 2 towns over did the framing work for free, told my mother he'd grown up eating her pancakes on Sunday mornings, and this was the least he could do. People I'd never met sent letters with checks folded inside, some for $5, some for $500, all of them saying some version of the same thing. Thank you for not staying quiet. I flew home for the reopening. I wore my dress uniform that day, not because I wanted attention, but because my mother asked me to, and there are very few requests from that woman I've ever been able to refuse. The whole town showed up, I mean that literally. Main Street was closed off, folding chairs set up on the sidewalk, a local band playing something that sounded like it belonged at a county fair. And my mother stood at the center of it all in a new dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, holding a pair of oversized scissors in her one good hand, while the other rested, still slightly stiff, at her side. Somebody had commissioned a small bronze plaque, mounted beside the door where the old bell still hung. I read it 3 times before the ceremony started, because I wanted to make sure I had it memorized before I watched my mother read it for the first time in front of everyone. Justice begins when one person refuses to stay silent. She cut the ribbon. The crowd cheered in that particular way small towns cheer, warm and a little rough around the edges. And then everyone filed inside for coffee and pie, and the diner that had witnessed the worst afternoon of my mother's life became, in that single moment, something else entirely. A landmark. A promise kept in public. I didn't give a speech. Several people asked me to, a local reporter included, but I shook my head each time. This wasn't my day to speak. I found a booth in the corner instead, the same corner I'd sat in wearing an old sweatshirt months earlier, watching Travis Kane walk in like he owned the place, and I ordered a slice of my mother's apple pie and ate it slowly, letting the noise of the reopening wash over me. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, wandered over at some point while her mother was distracted talking to a neighbor. She looked at my uniform with the particular unguarded curiosity that only children seem to have left in them. "Are you a police officer?" she asked. I smiled. "No. Are you a soldier? I am, I said. But that's not really why I'm here today. She tilted her head, waiting for more, the way kids do when an answer doesn't quite satisfy them. Then who are you? She asked. I thought about my father on that porch, iced tea sweating onto the wood, telling me never to use my uniform for revenge. I thought about Harold Weiss's satchel, 3 sets of duplicates hidden in safe deposit boxes across 2 states, because he learned decades ago that paper only disappears if you only keep 1 copy. I thought about Kayla standing on a porch in a half-zipped hoodie, handing over a phone because my mother had always been good to her. I thought about 30 families who found their courage only after somebody else found theirs first. I'm just somebody's daughter, I told her. She seemed satisfied with that, the way children usually are with answers that sound simple, even when they're carrying something much larger underneath. She ran back to her mother, and I sat there a moment longer, looking at the photograph my mother had hung behind the register. Her and my father, decades younger, standing in front of the same diner the week it first opened. Both of them grinning like they had no idea yet what this small building would come to mean. I kept my promise, Dad, I thought. And something in my chest finally, quietly, settled into place. Because that's really what this story was always about. Not a slap. Not even a family. It was about what happens when one person, just one, decides that silence isn't an option anymore. And how that single decision can ripple out further than anyone standing in that diner that day could ever have imagined.